In the spring of 1998, a senior official at the United States Treasury picked up a telephone and called the chair of an independent federal agency. According to that chair's senior aide, Michael Greenberger, the caller said he had 13 bankers in his office who believed she was about to cause the worst financial crisis since the end of the Second World War. The call concerned 4 words: a concept release. On May 7, 1998, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, chaired by Brooksley Born, published a formal request for public comment on a market then valued near $29 trillion in notional interest rate swaps, currency swaps, and interest rate options. It cited a 1997 government report that had already logged 360 substantial losses tied to over-the-counter derivatives sales practices. Born had chaired the commission since August of 1996. The market she proposed to study traded almost entirely off any exchange between banks and large institutions, with no public reporting requirement and no central clearing. The instruments were called swaps, private contracts in which 2 counterparties exchanged streams of payment, often tied to interest rates or currencies, priced and settled entirely between themselves. No regulator saw the trade. No exchange recorded it. The 1997 report that Born's release cited had been commissioned by Congress, and it had recommended a comprehensive study of the sales practices and counterparty relationships behind those 360 losses. The Securities and Exchange Commission had proposed its own rules 11 weeks earlier, on December 30, 1997, creating for the first time a comprehensive regulatory regime for the largest OTC derivatives dealers. The Office of Thrift Supervision followed in April with its own proposed revision of what it called its outmoded regulations governing new derivative instruments. On March 11, 1998, before Born's release was even published, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin had already written to Congress on behalf of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, declining to conduct the study the 1997 report had recommended. The Working Group, he wrote, functioned as a mechanism to exchange information across regulatory lines, not to launch new inquiries. Born proceeded anyway. The concept releaser commission issued in May asked, in plain regulatory language, whether the existing exemptions that let this market operate without oversight still made sense. The reaction arrived within hours. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, Rubin, and Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Arthur Levitt issued a joint statement citing what they called grave concerns. Deputy Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers told Congress the release had, in his words, cast the shadow of regulatory uncertainty over an otherwise thriving market, raising risks for the stability and competitiveness of American derivative trading. Born had asked a question about disclosure. 3 of the government's most senior financial officials answered that the question itself was the danger. Before the release had even reached print, Born had already taken her proposal to a meeting of the working group, held in a wood-paneled conference room at the Treasury Department. Her aide, Daniel Waldman, recalled Greenspan telling her the commission should not proceed, and Rubin telling her it could not. According to Greenberger's later account, Born had raised similar concerns with Greenspan directly at an earlier lunch in the Federal Reserve's private dining room, and Greenspan had closed that exchange by telling her the 2 of them would never agree about fraud. Born released the concept paper anyway, over the objection of every other regulator in the room. Greenspan's own public position, stated the same day the release was published, was that the market's rapid growth had occurred during a period of prosperity in which losses across the financial system had been remarkably small, and that the professionals trading these instruments were capable of overseeing themselves without a federal agency doing it for them. In July of 1998, Greenspan, Rubin, and Levitt testified before Congress and asked for a moratorium, a suspension of the CFTC's rulemaking authority over swaps until the working group could complete a study of its own. Congress granted it. Legislation enacted that year, at the request of Treasury, the Federal Reserve Board, and the SSEC froze the CFTC's authority over swap agreements and hybrid instruments through March 30, 1999. The statute's own text was explicit. The Commission, it read, may not propose or issue any rule, regulation, interpretation, or policy statement that restricts or regulates activity in a qualifying hybrid instrument or swap agreement. This was not an internal agency decision, and it was not the outcome of a lawsuit. It was an act of Congress, requested by the very regulators whose concerns the concept release had provoked, that suspended a sitting chair's statutory rulemaking power by name of instrument. Arthur Levitt did not know Born personally. He later said colleagues had described her to him as irascible, difficult, stubborn, and unreasonable, and that Greenspan and Rubin had persuaded him. Her proposal risked turmoil in a functioning market, a conclusion Levitt would eventually call, in his own words, clearly a mistake. That reassessment came years later. In 1998, the vote against her had been unanimous among her fellow regulators. The moratorium had been in effect for barely a month when long-term capital management, a hedge fund built on derivatives positions many times the size of its capital, came close to collapse. Federal Reserve officials brokered a private rescue by 14 banks that September and October to prevent a broader unwinding. On October 15, 1998, Born told an audience at the Chicago-Kent Commodities Law Institute that most of the issues raised by the fund's near failure, thin transparency, heavy leverage, insufficient prudential controls, and a lack of coordination among regulators across borders, had already been raised 5 months earlier, in her commission's May concept release. She said this without claiming vindication. She applauded Rubin's renewed call for the working group to study the question, the same study his March letter had declined to conduct on its own initiative 7 months before. The GAO's original recommendation, that a comprehensive review examine sales practices and counterparty relationships across the market, was still the recommendation the working group had not carried out. The moratorium was not lifted in response. On January 20, 1999, the CFTC announced that Born did not intend to seek a second term, stating she had been asked by the Office of Presidential Personnel whether she wished to continue, and had decided instead to return to private law practice. Her resignation took effect on June 1, 1999, shortly after Congress had passed the legislation restricting her commission's authority over derivatives. The restriction that had begun as a temporary moratorium became permanent law 18 months later. On December 21, 2000, President Clinton signed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which excluded from regulation any swap transaction between eligible institutional counterparties that was individually negotiated and not executed on a public trading facility. Where the 1998 moratorium had merely frozen the CFTC's hand, the 2000 Act closed it by statute. The specific gap the concept release had proposed to study, disclosure, record-keeping, and counterparty transparency in a market by then estimated in the tens of trillions of dollars, was not resolved. It was excluded from the jurisdiction of any regulator with the authority to study it. By 2007, the American International Group had built a credit default swap book with a notional value at its peak of $527 billion, according to later testimony from CFTC Chairman Gary Gensler. Selling insurance-like protection on corporate debt and mortgage-backed securities had been lucrative for the firm in the years before, in a market where no clearinghouse and no regulator recorded the position. In mid-September of 2008, AIG's credit ratings were downgraded, and it could no longer raise the collateral its swap counterparties were contractually owed. Days earlier, Lehman Brothers had entered bankruptcy, still a party to more than 900,000 separate over-the-counter derivatives contracts. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission later found that the interconnections these contracts created among the largest financial institutions multiplied losses across the system and produced the panic that nearly brought down the wider financial system. Brooksley Born sat on that commission when it issued its final report in January of 2011. In an interview broadcast the year before, on the PBS Frontline documentary titled The Warning, she said, "We didn't truly know the dangers of the market because it was a dark market." The defenders of the 1998 moratorium had not argued at the time that the risks Born identified were imaginary. Greenspan, Rubin, Summers, and Levitt argued instead that raising the question in public through a formal request for comment posed a more immediate danger to a thriving market than the underlying exposure did. That was a real position, held by 4 of the government's most senior financial officials, and it was tested a decade later against a market that had grown, gone uncleared, and gone dark in largely the way the 1997 report and the 1998 release had described. The concept release itself was never formally withdrawn as mistaken. It was simply never acted on. It sat, dated, and footnoted, a public federal document available to anyone who cared to read it, for the 10 years between its publication and the week Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy.